23rd of March, 1934. The rain hammered against the windows of the Admiralty Research Laboratory in Teddington, England, as Robert Watson Watt stared at a classified document that could either make him a hero or destroy his career. The memo from the Air Ministry was simple, yet desperate. Britain needed a way to detect enemy aircraft before they appeared on the horizon. What Watson Watt held in his hands, however, was far more dangerous than anyone had requested, a concept so powerful it violated international maritime law. The engineer's hands trembled slightly as he sketched modifications to his original radio detection design. He wasn't supposed to be working on this. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had explicitly limited offensive naval technologies. And what Watson Watt envisioned would revolutionize naval warfare in ways the treaty's authors had never imagined. His death ray research, initially dismissed as science fiction, had evolved into something far more practical: radio waves that could not only detect ships but guide weapons directly to them with unprecedented accuracy. According to records from the Imperial War Museum archives, Watson Watt's team had stumbled upon this application almost by accident during routine atmospheric research in early 1934. They discovered that radio pulses didn't just bounce off metal objects. They could measure distance, speed, and trajectory with shocking precision. The implications were staggering. A ship equipped with this technology could strike targets beyond visual range, rendering traditional naval tactics obsolete overnight. His colleague, Arnold Wilkins, entered the laboratory, shaking water from his coat. "Still working on the aircraft detection proposal?" he asked, glancing at Watson Watt's cluttered desk. The senior engineer quickly covered his unauthorized schematics. "Something like that," he replied, his Scottish accent thickening with stress. What Wilkins didn't know, what nobody could know yet, was that Watson Watt had extended the concept far beyond its original scope. He envisioned a network of transmitters and receivers that could create an invisible web across the ocean, turning the sea itself into a killing field. The political climate made his work even more precarious. Germany had withdrawn from the League of Nations the previous year, and intelligence reports suggested they were secretly rearming. Britain's naval superiority, maintained since Trafalgar, suddenly seemed vulnerable. The Royal Navy's mighty battleships and cruisers were designed for visual range combat, their crews trained in tactics unchanged since Nelson's era. Watson Watt's system would make these centuries-old strategies worthless, but it would also violate treaties Britain had championed. He remembered the conversation with Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding 3 weeks earlier. Dowding had pulled him aside after a demonstration and whispered urgently, "If war comes, and it will come, I don't care about treaties written by peacetime politicians. I care about keeping German bombers away from London. Do you understand?" Watson Watt understood perfectly. The Marshal was giving him unofficial permission to explore forbidden territory. Now, alone in his laboratory with rain drumming a relentless rhythm overhead, Watson Watt made his decision. He would continue his illegal research. He would perfect the technology that would eventually be called radar radio detection and ranging. He would create something even more devastating: a system that could guide torpedoes and artillery shells with mechanical precision, transforming every warship into an instrument of surgical destruction. History would judge whether he was a visionary or a war criminal. But first, Britain needed to survive what was coming. 16th of June, 1935. Commander James Somerville stood on the deck of HMS Rodney, watching technicians install strange equipment that looked like oversized bed springs mounted on rotating pedestals. The battleship's crew whispered nervously among themselves. Rumors had spread through the fleet that this mysterious apparatus could see through fog and darkness, though no one quite understood how. What they didn't know was that today's demonstration would prove something far more sinister than mere detection. Watson Watt had spent 15 months refining his system in absolute secrecy. The Daventry experiment of the previous year had successfully detected aircraft at 8 miles distance, convincing the Air Ministry to fund further research. But Watson Watt had secretly diverted resources toward naval applications. Working through the night in his Bodsey Manor facility with a small team sworn to silence. The technology they'd developed was codenamed Chain Home, though its maritime variant had no official designation because officially it didn't exist. The target for today's test was the decommissioned cruiser HMS Centurion. Anchored 23 miles off the Suffolk coast, standard naval doctrine held that accurate gunnery beyond 12. Miles was impossible due to the Earth's curvature and atmospheric conditions. Admirals had spent their entire careers mastering the art of closing distance for decisive engagement. Watson Watt was about to render that expertise obsolete. Admiral Sir Ernest Chatfield, first Sea Lord, observed from the bridge with undisguised skepticism. According to declassified Admiralty records held at the National Archives in Kew, Chatfield had initially opposed the entire radar program as a waste of resources better spent on traditional improvements. He considered Watson Watt a meddlesome civilian who understood radio waves, but nothing about naval warfare. "Gentlemen," Chatfield announced loudly, "I'll believe this contraption works when I see it sink a ship I cannot see with my own eyes." Watson Watt felt sweat trickle down his back, despite the cool maritime breeze. His chief assistant, Edward Bowen, checked the equipment one final time. The system was elegantly simple in concept, but devilishly complex in execution. Transmitters would send radio pulses outward in a sweeping pattern. When these pulses struck the metal hull of a ship, they would reflect back to receivers that measured the time delay. Simple mathematics converted this delay into precise range, bearing, and even speed. The data then fed directly into a mechanical computer that calculated firing solutions for the battleship's 15-inch guns. Commence demonstration, Somerville ordered at precisely 100 hours. The radar array began rotating with a low hum that set teeth on edge. Within 30 seconds, an operator called out, "Contact bearing 270, range 22,800 yards. Chatfield's expression remained neutral, but his eyes widened slightly. HMS Centurion lay exactly where the radar indicated, completely invisible beyond the horizon's curve. "Can your apparatus guide our guns?" Chatfield asked quietly. This was the moment Watson Watt had both anticipated and dreaded. Directing fire beyond visual range transformed radar from defensive tool to offensive weapon, precisely what international treaties sought to prevent. "Yes, Admiral," he replied. With accuracy exceeding traditional methods at half the distance, what followed stunned every witness. Rodney's main guns traversed smoothly to the bearing indicated by radar. The mechanical computer whirred and clicked, calculating trajectory corrections for distance, wind, the Earth's rotation, and even temperature gradients in the atmosphere. At Chatfield's command, a single 15-inch shell roared from the forward turret. 37 seconds later, a towering column of water erupted just 20 yards from Centurion's port Bema, near miss, at impossible range against an invisible target. The deck fell silent, except for wind and waves. Then Chatfield spoke words that would echo through naval history. "Mr. Watson Watt, you've just made every navy in the world obsolete, including ours. God help us if the Germans learn what you've done." 2nd of November, 1936. Dr. Heinz Erich Hollmann sat in his laboratory at Telefunken's Berlin facility, staring at intelligence photographs that made his blood run cold. The grainy images showed unusual antenna rays along Britain's eastern coast structures that looked remarkably similar to his own experimental radar designs. For 3 years, German scientists had worked independently on radio detection, believing they led the world in this technology. These photographs suggested otherwise, and Hollmann knew exactly what that meant for Germany's military ambitions. The race was no longer secret. Both nations understood that whoever perfected radar first would control the coming war's tempo. But what Berlin didn't yet realize was that Britain had already crossed a line. Germany's military ethicists still debated. Watson Watt's team had weaponized their detection system into an integrated targeting network. According to documents from the German Federal Archives in Freiburg, Hollmann repeatedly warned Kriegsmarine leadership that Britain's radar development showed suspicious offensive characteristics, but his concerns were dismissed as paranoid speculation. Meanwhile, at Bawdsey Manor, Watson Watt faced a different crisis. The chain-home system worked brilliantly for coastal defense, but adapting it for shipboard use proved nightmarishly difficult. Ships moved, rolled, and pitched in ways that threw off calibrations. Salt spray corroded connections. The massive antennas required for long-range detection were impractical aboard anything smaller than a battleship. His team worked 18-hour days, testing, failing, and testing again. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The young physicist named Bernard Lovell suggested they abandon the huge fixed antennas in favor of a rotating dish that concentrated radio waves into a narrow beam. This centimetric radar used shorter wavelengths that were more precise, but shorter ranged. Watson Watt initially resisted. His engineering instincts favored the proven long-range system. But after a demonstration in March of 1937 showed the compact radar could detect destroyers at 12 miles and accurately track their movements, he became a convert. The Admiralty, now fully committed to the program, signed the project its own codename, Type 271 Radar. Production began in secret at various facilities across Britain. Workers manufactured components without knowing their ultimate purpose, assembling pieces of a puzzle whose complete picture remained classified at the highest levels. Security was so tight that even shipyard workers installing the equipment aboard new destroyers were told only that it was experimental wireless apparatus. Germany's intelligence services weren't blind to these developments. Abwehr agents reported suspicious activity at British shipyards and noted odd structures being installed on warships. Yet German Naval Command made a fatal assumption. They believed Britain was merely developing defensive detection systems similar to their own radar experiments. The possibility that Britain had created an integrated detection and targeting network seemed too advanced, too aggressive for the conservative Royal Navy. By mid-1938, Watt's team had refined their shipboard system into something truly formidable. The Type 271 could detect capital ships at 15 miles, cruisers at 12 miles, and destroyers at 8 miles in complete darkness or the thickest fog. More critically, it could feed targeting data directly to a ship's gunnery computer, enabling accurate fire at ranges previously thought impossible. The system reduced the complex mathematics of naval gunnery to simple coordinates that any trained operator could manage. Captain Harold Hickling, assigned to evaluate the technology, wrote in a classified report that still resides in Admiralty archives. This device fundamentally alters naval warfare. The side that sees first, shoots first, and hits first will win every engagement. Traditional notions of heroism, seamanship, and tactical brilliance become irrelevant when one side fights blind, while the other possesses perfect vision. Hickling understood what many admirals refused to accept. Centuries of naval tradition were ending, replaced by a new era where engineering mattered more than courage. 28th of May, 1941. Lieutenant Commander Edward Berthen stood in the operations room of HMS Sheffield, watching the Type 279 radar display with mounting tension. Somewhere in the Denmark Strait's cold darkness, the German battleship Bismarck was attempting to break into the Atlantic. Sheffield had been hunting the massive warship for 3 days, and now, at 02:15 hours, a contact appeared on the screen at 27,000 yards, over 13 miles. What followed in the next hours would prove Watt's illegal concept in the cruelest possible way. The chase of Bismarck had begun 4 days earlier when Swedish intelligence reported the ship's departure from Bergen. The Royal Navy deployed every available capital ship to intercept Germany's most powerful battleship before it could ravage Atlantic convoys. HMS Hood, pride of the British fleet, had engaged Bismarck on the 24th and been destroyed in a catastrophic explosion that killed all but 3 of her 1,400 crew. The loss shocked Britain to its core. Now Sheffield, along with HMS Norfolk and the battleship King George V, pursued the wounded German giant through fog and rough seas. Bismarck's captain, Ernst Lindemann, was one of Germany's finest naval commanders. Trained in traditional gunnery and ship handling, his crew had performed magnificently in the battle against Hood, achieving a lucky hit on the British battlecruiser's ammunition magazine from over 12 miles distance. Lindemann fought with 1941 technology guided by 19th century doctrine. He didn't know that his opponents could see him through darkness and weather, that every maneuver he made was tracked and predicted by systems he didn't understand. According to the official naval staff history compiled in 19, Sheffield's radar maintained continuous contact with Bismarck despite the German ship's evasive maneuvers. The destroyer relayed precise coordinates to Admiral John Tovey aboard King George V, painting a complete picture of Bismarck's position, course, and speed. For the first time in naval history, a fleet could coordinate attacks against an enemy they couldn't see, guided entirely by electromagnetic whispers bouncing off metal hulls miles away. At 0-8-40-7 hours on the 27th, the weather cleared enough for visual sighting. King George V and HMS Rodney, the same battleship Watt had used for his demonstration 6 years earlier, opened fire at extreme range. But the truly devastating barrage came from Sheffield and Norfolk, whose lighter guns were guided by radar fire control systems. Their 6-inch shells, while unable to penetrate Bismarck's heavy armor, systematically destroyed the German ship's fire control systems, communication equipment, and anti-aircraft defenses with uncanny accuracy. Lindemann's gunnery officers tried desperately to return effective fire, but they were fighting blind. Smoke, spray, and the low angle of morning sun made visual ranging nearly impossible. Bismarck's own primitive radar, designed only for navigation, couldn't provide the accuracy needed for fire control. German shells fell around the British ships in random patterns, occasionally scoring hits through sheer volume of fire, but the advantage lay entirely with the radar-equipped fleet. The battle became a massacre. For over 90 minutes, British ships poured shells into Bismarck from ranges and angles that would have been impossible using traditional methods. A German battleship, already damaged from the earlier fight with Hood and subsequent torpedo strikes from Swordfish aircraft, could neither flee nor fight effectively. Her guns fell silent one by one as radar-directed fire destroyed each turret. By 1000 hours, Bismarck was a burning wreck, kept afloat only by her excellent compartmentalization. Captain Benjamin Martin aboard Norfolk watched through binoculars as the final torpedoes struck Bismarck's hull. He later wrote in his private journal, now held at the Imperial War Museum, "I felt no triumph, only a kind of horror. We had killed a proud ship and 2,000 brave men, not through superior seamanship or courage, but because we possessed a technological advantage they couldn't counter. It felt less like combat than execution. Watt's invention has made warriors obsolete. We are now merely operators of increasingly efficient killing machines." As Bismarck slipped beneath the waves at 10:39 hours, taking Lindemann and most of his crew with her, a new era in warfare was confirmed. The ultimate ship killer wasn't a faster vessel, a bigger gun, or a braver crew. It was mathematics made visible by radio waves, transforming the ancient art of naval combat into cold, calculated science. 15th of August, 1943, Watt sat in a closed session of the Parliamentary Defense Committee, facing hostile questions about the technology he'd unleashed upon the world. 2 years into full-scale radar-guided naval warfare, Britain's advantage had multiplied exponentially. But so had the philosophical questions about what they'd created. Admiral Harold Stark, representing the United States Navy, had just presented casualty figures that made even hardened politicians blanch. Radar-equipped ships were destroying targets at a 5-to-1 ratio, turning naval battles into one-sided slaughters. The chairman, Sir Archibald Sinclair, Secretary of State for Air, read aloud from a captured German naval report that had reached London through intelligence channels. The document, written by Captain Zur C. Helmuth Brinkmann, described the sinking of the cruiser Scharnhorst with brutal clarity. "We fought ghosts that struck from beyond visible range in complete darkness. Our guns fired at empty ocean, while shells fell upon us with mechanical precision. This is not warfare. It is industrial butchery, made possible by British radiolocation technology that violates every principle of honorable naval combat." Watt listened with a growing sense of discomfort he couldn't shake. He'd known intellectually that his invention would kill. All weapons killed. But hearing the reality described in such stark terms forced him to confront questions he'd avoided during 7 years of focused development. Had he created a weapon so effective it was immoral? Did the same ethical standards that banned poison gas and dum-dum bullets apply to radar? Where was the line between military advantage and unfair advantage? According to contemporary records from the Parliamentary Archives at Westminster, the August 1943 session lasted nearly 6 hours and became heated at several points. Conservative MP Sir Henry Page Croft argued that radar's lopsided effectiveness made it ungentlemanly, and that Britain should share the technology with Germany to level the playing field. The suggestion was absurd from a strategic standpoint, but it reflected genuine disquiet about the nature of radar-enabled warfare. Watt finally responded, his Scottish accent thick with emotion, "Gentlemen, you task me with creating weapons and then condemn me when they work too well. Every advance in military technology, the longbow, the musket, the torpedo, the submarine, was called unfair by those on the wrong end of it. Should we have shared the Spitfire's design with the Luftwaffe because our fighters proved superior?
Ow.
War is not a sporting match governed by Queensberry rules. It is survival." But privately, Watt struggled with doubts. His diary entries from this period, now available to researchers at Churchill College, Cambridge, reveal a man increasingly troubled by his creation's consequences. On September 3rd, he wrote, "I designed radar to protect Britain from invasion, to give warning against bomber raids, to save civilian lives." The transformation into an offensive weapons system was logical, perhaps inevitable, but was it right? Each efficiency improvement, each increase in range and accuracy, means more sailors dying and burning ships, often without firing a shot in their own defense. The ethical debates extended beyond Parliament. Naval officers themselves were divided. Some particularly younger commanders who'd grown up with technology embraced radar as the future of warfare. Others, products of Britannia Royal Naval College's traditional education, felt radar removed skill and courage from combat, reducing battle to mere technical competence. Captain Louis Mountbatten, himself a technical innovator, observed in a letter to Admiral Andrew Cunningham, "We've made naval warfare scientific, and in doing so have removed much of its humanity, both good and bad. There's no romance in killing an enemy you never see, but perhaps there's also less hate." The broader public remained largely ignorant of these debates. Wartime censorship prevented detailed reporting on radar capabilities, and most civilians understood it only as a mysterious technology that helped detect enemy aircraft. They didn't know that every major naval engagement since Bismarck had been decided by radar advantages, or that German sailors now sailed with the knowledge that any encounter with British ships likely meant death before they could fire back effectively. Dr. Edward Appleton, another radar pioneer, visited Watson Watt in late October 1943, according to Appleton's biography published in 1971. The two men discussed whether they bore personal responsibility for deaths caused by their invention. Appleton argued that scientists couldn't control how their discoveries were used, that blame lay with politicians and military leaders who chose to employ technology for destruction. Watson Watt disagreed. "We knew," he told Appleton. "Every blueprint, every improvement, every field test, we knew it would kill. We cannot hide behind the excuse of pure research when we actively design systems specifically for military applications." 3rd of January 1945. Captain Viktor Lebedev of the Soviet Navy examined the radar equipment aboard USS St. Louis with barely concealed envy. America had provided the Soviet Union with dozens of destroyer escorts equipped with increasingly sophisticated radar systems. But the Soviets had been explicitly forbidden from examining the most sensitive components. Now in Murmansk harbor, Lebedev used his brief inspection tour to memorize every detail he could observe. The ultimate ship killer was about to proliferate beyond Western control. The technology transfer between Britain and America had begun even before Pearl Harbor. In September 1940, during the desperate days when Britain stood alone against Germany, Prime Minister Winston Churchill authorized the Tizard mission, a team of scientists who brought Britain's most precious military secrets to America, including complete radar designs and the revolutionary cavity magnetron that made microwave radar possible. It was an unprecedented act of trust, sharing technology that had cost billions to develop and represented Britain's primary advantage at sea. According to documents from the Truman Presidential Library, American industry rapidly improved upon British designs. By mid-1943, U.S. shipyards were installing radar systems more advanced than anything Britain possessed. The SG surface search radar could detect battleships at 25 miles, while the Mark 8 fire control radar could track targets and guide guns simultaneously, effectively automating what British systems still required human operators to coordinate. American naval doctrine evolved to exploit these advantages, developing tactics that would have been impossible just 5 years earlier. The Pacific War demonstrated radar's devastating effectiveness in an even more dramatic fashion than the Atlantic had. At the Battle of Cape Ingago in October 1944, American carriers used radar to coordinate airstrikes against Japanese ships that never saw their attackers until bombs were already falling. Japanese Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo later told interrogators that his fleet fought against an enemy who seemed to possess supernatural awareness of our every movement, who struck from beyond our ability to respond, whose advantages in detection made our traditional training in night combat worthless. But the monopoly couldn't last. German scientists had continued their own radar development throughout the war, though they consistently lagged behind Allied progress. By early 1945, the Kriegsmarine had finally deployed primitive fire control radar on its few remaining surface ships. More ominously, Soviet intelligence had systematically collected radar technology through espionage, diplomatic pressure, and simple observation of Lend-Lease equipment. The NKVD's Technical Intelligence Directorate had made radar acquisition a top priority as early as 1942. Watson Watt, now serving as an advisor to the Ministry of Aircraft Production, watched this proliferation with mixed feelings. In a memorandum to the War Cabinet dated February 7, 1945, he wrote, "The genie cannot be returned to its bottle. Radar technology will spread to every nation with industrial capacity, and the relative advantage Britain once enjoyed will diminish toward zero. In 10 years, perhaps less, every navy will possess radar capabilities roughly equivalent to our current systems. At that point, we will once again face enemies on equal technological footing, but with the added knowledge that battles will be decided at ranges where ships never see each other, where human judgment and seamanship matter less than the quality of one's electronics." The post-war world was already taking shape in ways Watson Watt found troubling. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships had commissioned studies on next-generation detection systems that would make current radar look primitive. Scientists spoke casually of guided missiles that could seek out ships autonomously, of computer-controlled weapon systems that could make targeting decisions faster than any human, of electronic warfare systems designed specifically to blind enemy radar. The ultimate ship killer was evolving into something even more impersonal and efficient. In May 1945, as Germany surrendered, Allied intelligence teams raced to capture German radar facilities and scientists before the Soviets could claim them. The paperclip operation brought hundreds of German engineers to America and Britain, where they would contribute their knowledge to the next generation of military electronics. Among the facilities captured intact was the Telefunken laboratory, where Dr. Hallman had worked. The same scientist who'd warned about British radar capabilities 9 years earlier, Hallman's research notes revealed that German scientists had independently discovered many of the same principles Watson Watt had developed, confirming that radar technology was an inevitable discovery rather than a unique British insight. By July, American intelligence reported that Soviet ships in the Baltic were using radar equipment clearly reverse-engineered from Lend-Lease destroyers. The detection was crude, the accuracy poor compared to Western standards, but it worked. Within months, Soviet scientists would improve these systems, drawing on captured German research and their own considerable theoretical knowledge. The Cold War's technological competition was already beginning, and radar would be its first battleground. Watson Watt attended a victory celebration in London on August 15th, the day Japan surrendered. He should have felt triumphant. His invention had contributed immeasurably to Allied victory, had saved countless lives by reducing the length of the war, had helped secure freedom for millions. Instead, he felt exhausted and strangely empty. He had created the ultimate ship killer, and now the entire world was rushing to match his creation, to build their own versions, to develop countermeasures and countermeasures in an endless technological spiral. 11th of September, 1952. Commander Eugene Fluckey stood on the bridge of USS Tusk, submarine equipped with the latest radar technology, watching a Soviet destroyer pass within 4 miles, completely unaware of the American boat's presence. The Cold War had transformed radar from a wartime advantage into a permanent feature of naval operations, but it had also created unexpected complications that Watson Watt never anticipated when sketching those first forbidden blueprints. The technology that had made surface ships deadly efficient was now their greatest vulnerability. During the past 7 years, military engineers had developed radar-absorbing materials, electronic countermeasures, and anti-radiation missiles specifically designed to target the electromagnetic emissions that made radar possible. Ships equipped with powerful radar transmitted their positions to anyone listening. Problem: the submarine community exploited ruthlessly. According to declassified U.S. Navy documents from the Office of Naval Intelligence, Soviet naval doctrine by 1952 explicitly called for targeting radar-equipped vessels first, knowing that blinding the enemy's detection capability would render their entire fleet tactically impaired. The arms race Watson Watt feared had materialized with frightening speed. The Soviet Union had matched Western radar capabilities within 3 years of obtaining their first working samples. By 1950, Soviet ships routinely employed jamming systems that could degrade Allied radar effectiveness by 70% or more. American and British engineers responded with frequency-hopping radar that switched wavelengths too quickly to jam effectively. Soviet engineers countered with broadband jammers. Each advancement spawned a countermeasure, creating a technological treadmill that consumed billions in development costs. More troubling were the accidents. On June 26, 1952, the destroyer USS Hobson collided with the aircraft carrier USS Wasp during night operations, killing 176 sailors. The investigation revealed that both ships were operating under radar control, and a miscommunication between radar operators had led to the collision, precisely the kind of accident impossible in the days when ships relied on visual navigation and human judgment. Similar incidents were occurring in the Soviet Navy, though their secretive military culture prevented accurate casualty counts. Watson Watt, now 60 years old and officially retired, followed these developments with growing alarm. In a speech to the Institution of Electrical Engineers in London on March 14, 1952, he reflected on his creation's evolution. "I designed radar to answer a specific question: where is the enemy? It answered that question admirably, perhaps too well. We have become so dependent on electronic detection that the human element, judgment, intuition, seamanship, has atrophied. When radar fails, as it inevitably does during equipment malfunctions or heavy jamming, we find crews unable to operate effectively using the methods their predecessors mastered." The speech drew criticism from military officials who considered it defeatist and unhelpful. Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, now retired but still influential, publicly rebuked Watson Watt. "You cannot uninvent technology, nor would we wish to. Radar saved Britain in our darkest hour. Yes, it has complications and dangers, but so does every tool humans have created from fire onward. The question is not whether to use radar, but how to use it wisely." The exchange highlighted a generational divide between those who'd lived through the desperate early war years when radar was salvation, and a newer generation questioning whether that salvation had come at acceptable cost. The naval applications of radar had expanded far beyond Watson Watt's original vision. 1952 saw the first successful test of the Talos missile, guided to its target by shipboard radar that could track aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles. The ultimate ship killer was evolving into the ultimate aircraft killer, with implications that extended beyond naval warfare into strategic bombing, air defense, and ultimately the nuclear stalemate. Radar-guided surface-to-air missiles meant that high-altitude bombing, the strategy that had destroyed Germany and Japan, was becoming suicidal against a prepared enemy. The Korean War provided a brutal testing ground for these new realities. Communist forces, equipped with Soviet radar and missiles, shot down American B-9 bombers with alarming regularity. The bombers that had flown nearly unopposed over Japan just 7 years earlier now fell to radar-directed anti-aircraft fire and primitive guided missiles. Naval commanders watched these developments with grim understanding. What worked against aircraft would eventually work against ships. Already, Soviet engineers were developing anti-ship missiles that could be launched from submarines or aircraft, guided to their targets by the very radar emissions their victims used for detection. In private correspondence with his longtime colleague Edward Bowen, Watson Watt expressed deep ambivalence about his legacy. A letter dated October 8, 1952, preserved in the Watson Watt Papers at the Science Museum in London, contained a revealing passage. "I set out to protect my country and succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. In doing so, I've helped create a world where future wars will be decided not by human courage or tactical brilliance, but by which side has superior electronics. I'm not certain this is an improvement. The battlefield has become so abstract, so disconnected from human agency, that warfare risks becoming merely an exchange of missiles guided by computers, a mathematical equation, rather than a human endeavor." The irony wasn't lost on Watson Watt that his invention, created partially in defiance of international treaties, meant to limit military technology's destructiveness, had itself become a treaty subject. The 1951 talks in Geneva included discussions about limiting radar capabilities, though these went nowhere. How could one verify compliance with radar restrictions? How could technology that served both civilian and military purposes be meaningfully controlled? The questions were unanswerable, highlighting the fundamental problem with attempting to regulate scientific knowledge. 27th of June, 1973. Sir Robert Watson Watt, now 81 years old and confined to a wheelchair, attended the dedication ceremony for the Radar Memorial at Bawdsey Manor, The facility where he'd created the ultimate ship killer had been sold years earlier, converted into other uses, but this one building was preserved as a museum honoring the scientists who'd changed warfare forever. As a military band played and dignitaries delivered speeches about innovation and victory, Watt's mind drifted across 40 years of consequences. The world of 1973 bore little resemblance to the one in which he'd sketched those first illegal designs. Naval warfare had evolved exactly as he'd feared and predicted. Modern warships bristled with radar systems, from massive air search arrays to compact navigation units to missile guidance systems. The USS Long Beach, the world's first nuclear-powered cruiser, carried 9 different radar systems serving different functions. Soviet Kresta-class cruisers matched this capability. The simple question, "Where is the enemy?" had spawned an entire scientific discipline, with universities offering degrees in radar engineering. According to a NATO analysis presented at the dedication ceremony, radar had indeed become the ultimate ship killer, but not in the direct sense Watt had originally conceived. The October 1967 sinking of Israeli destroyer Eilat by Egyptian Styx missiles, guided to their target by radar, demonstrated that surface ships themselves were becoming obsolete. The missiles could be launched from beyond visual range, guided by radar to within terminal range, then switched to self-guidance for the final approach. The human element had been reduced to pushing buttons and watching screens. The Vietnam War had provided the most recent demonstration of radar's evolution. American aircraft carriers operated with complete electronic awareness of hundreds of miles of surrounding ocean and airspace, coordinating complex operations involving dozens of ships and hundreds of aircraft. Soviet trawlers, bristling with electronic intelligence equipment, shadowed these fleets, mapping their radar frequencies and recording their operating procedures. Both sides understood that any future conflict would begin with electronic warfare jamming, spoofing, and blinding enemy radar before firing a single conventional weapon. Watt's original concern about violating international law seemed quaint from the perspective of 1973. The Washington Naval Treaty that had so worried him in 1934 had collapsed years before his radar research began, swept away by resurgent nationalism and the inevitability of another world war. Modern international law didn't attempt to restrict specific technologies, but rather their application's prohibitions against attacking civilian targets, restrictions on weapons causing unnecessary suffering, bans on certain chemical and biological agents. Radar, for all its lethality, killed cleanly and precisely, making it legally acceptable, even as it made warfare more efficient. The speeches concluded, and Watt was wheeled to the museum's main exhibit, a restored chain-home receiver alongside one of the original Type 271 shipboard radars. Young engineering students crowded around, eager to meet the legendary inventor. One asked the question Watt had been wrestling with for decades. "Sir Robert, do you regret creating radar, knowing how it's been used?" The old engineer was silent for a long moment, his weathered hands trembling slightly on the wheelchair's armrests. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but clear. "I regret nothing I did to save Britain from invasion and Nazi tyranny. Radar helped win that war, and winning was necessary, morally imperative. But I have complicated feelings about what came after. Radar was my answer to a desperate military problem. That it became a permanent fixture of warfare, that it evolved into something far more sophisticated and deadly than I imagined, that it spawned an arms race still accelerating today. These developments trouble me. I created a tool. Humanity chose how to use it. I cannot control that any more than Alfred Nobel could control how his dynamite was employed." In truth, Watt's answer was more nuanced than he could express publicly. His private writings, which would be published posthumously, revealed a man profoundly conflicted about his legacy. He'd saved countless lives by shortening the war, yet his invention had also made future wars more destructive. He'd given Britain a critical advantage that preserved democracy in its darkest hour. Yet he'd accelerated humanity's rush toward automated warfare, where human judgment mattered less with each passing year. The dedication ceremony ended with a flypast of modern Royal Air Force jets. Their movements, coordinated by radar systems, descended directly from Watt's wartime work. As the roar of engines faded, Watt was approached by a young Soviet engineer named Alexei Borisov, attending as part of a technical exchange program, a small thaw in Cold War tensions.
Ow!
Through an interpreter, Borisov said, "Sir Robert, in my country you are studied as a master of applied physics.
Oh.
Your work transcends politics. Science serves whoever masters it first." Watson Watt found the comment both flattering and deeply disturbing. It captured the essential paradox of his life's work. Radar was scientifically brilliant and strategically invaluable, yet morally neutral. The same technology that detected incoming bombers threatening London civilians also guided missiles toward ships filled with sailors who'd never see their killers. Excellence in engineering didn't equate to virtue in application. Later that evening, back in his London flat, Watson Watt dictated final additions to his memoirs. His secretary, Margaret Henley, had worked with him for 15 years and knew when he was struggling with difficult thoughts. "The young man from Russia asked me a question I couldn't answer publicly," Watson Watt said. "He asked if I would do it again, knowing everything that followed. Margaret, I honestly don't know. In 1934, I saw a clear path. Britain needed defense against aerial attack, and I could provide it. I didn't foresee guided missiles, electronic warfare, the complete transformation of naval combat. I certainly didn't foresee that by 1973 major powers would possess nuclear weapons delivered by radar-guided ballistic missiles, the ultimate evolution of my work." According to records maintained by his estate, Watson Watt spent his final years. He would die in December 1973, 6 months after the Bodsey ceremony, attempting to articulate a philosophy of scientific responsibility. He corresponded with Robert Oppenheimer, who'd faced similar questions after creating the atomic bomb. Oppenheimer's famous quote, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," resonated with Watson Watt, though he rejected its theatrical despair. His own conclusion, expressed in a letter to Oppenheimer dated August 3, 1973, was more pragmatic. "We cannot unknow what we've discovered. We can only hope that the people who employ our discoveries possess wisdom proportional to the power we've given them." History suggests this hope is usually disappointed. The ultimate ship killer had indeed been created, but Watson Watt recognized in his final months that he'd built something larger and more complex than a mere weapon system. Radar had become humanity's way of extending perception beyond natural limits, of seeing through darkness and distance, of transforming invisible electromagnetic waves into actionable information. This capability was revolutionary in warfare, but it also enabled civilian aviation, weather forecasting, astronomy, and countless other peaceful applications. The same principles that guided shells to their targets also safely landed commercial aircraft and tracked hurricanes threatening coastal populations. Perhaps this duality was Watson Watt's true legacy. He'd created a technology so fundamental that it transcended its original military purpose, becoming woven into the fabric of modern civilization. Every airport control tower, every weather station, every police speed trap employed descendants of his wartime invention. The illegal idea that violated international treaties in 1934 had become so ubiquitous by 1973 that life without it was unimaginable. On the morning of December 5, 1973, Sir Robert Watson Watt died peacefully in his sleep at age 81. The obituaries praised him as the father of radar, the man who saved Britain, a scientific genius whose work had changed history. Few mentioned the moral complexity of his achievement or the questions that had haunted him in later years. History preferred heroes to philosophers, clear narratives to ambiguous truths. But in the archives, he left behind thousands of pages of notes. Letters, diary entries, and technical documents. More complete picture emerges. Watson Watt was neither pure hero nor cautionary villain, but something more human and more interesting. Brilliant engineer who solved the problem placed before him, made choices under desperate circumstances, and who spent the rest of his life wrestling with their implications. He created the ultimate ship killer not from malice but from necessity, not to wage war but to prevent invasion, not to kill sailors but to protect civilians. Whether that justification was sufficient remains an open question. The ships that died at distances their crews couldn't comprehend, the sailors who drowned in vessels sunk by enemies they never saw. The escalating technological competition that consumed resources and talent that might have served peace, these costs were real and lasting. Yet so was the alternative. A Britain conquered by Nazi Germany, a world enslaved by fascism, a civilization extinguished because democracies lacked the will or ability to defend themselves with every available means. In the end, Watt's legacy was neither simply good nor simply bad, but profoundly human. The story of a man who used extraordinary intelligence to solve an existential problem, who succeeded beyond all reasonable expectation, and who discovered that success in one realm created challenges in others. The ultimate ship killer was born from an illegal idea, nurtured by desperate need, and matured into something far more significant than its creator intended. It saved a nation, transformed warfare, and forced humanity to confront questions about technology and responsibility that remain unanswered today. As military historians would note in decades following Watt's death, radar represented a pivotal moment in the industrialization of warfare, the point at which electronic systems began displacing human senses and judgments in combat. Every advancement since, from computer-guided weapons to autonomous drones to artificial intelligence, targeting systems, descended directly from Watt's fundamental insight that electromagnetic waves could be weaponized through detection and ranging. The engineer who worried about violating international treaties in 1934 would have been astonished to see 21st century warfare, where battles are fought increasingly by machines guided by descendants of his invention, where human operators sit thousands of miles from combat zones, where the question, "Where is the enemy?" is answered by computers processing data from dozens of sensor types Watt never imagined. Yet the core principle remains unchanged. Whoever sees first, strikes first, and wins. Sir Robert Watt created the ultimate ship killer. In doing so, he created the template for modern warfare. For better and for worse, forever changing how nations fight and die. History will debate whether this was humanity's salvation or curse. Watt himself never resolved that question, and perhaps that uncertainty is the most honest legacy any inventor of deadly technology can leave behind.